Hey all, I want to spend some time reviewing here some concepts that you're going to be tested on the AP exam. And after speaking with a few students, I was able to just get some feedback, and the students suggested that I make a video just reviewing some fundamental concepts here for with Java. And so that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to spend some time here talking about the structure of a class, and why you want to structure a class this way. So this might be more than a multiple part video. So I don't want to drag this too long, maybe 30 minutes, and then if I need to, I can do a second video to continue. But Java is called object-oriented programming for a reason, because we create classes, and then once you create a class, you can make multiple objects using the same class. For example, let's say that you have you own a store and you have employees in your store, and you want to be able to store their information, right? And obviously you could do that many different ways. You could use programs like Microsoft Word or Excel or even Google Documents or Google Sheets. Excuse me. But let's say that you may want to manipulate the data here and there. So, or you might want to maybe you have the employee every day. The employee checks in and then checks out. And you might want to look through the data and see if the employee checked in late or early. And so you can use Java to create databases. Meaning that you'll have information stored, and then if you want to retrieve that information, you make the appropriate class to be able to retrieve information for each employee, rather than have to store by hand all the information for every single employee. You make one class that allows you to make objects, multiple employee objects. And so we're going to start with that. We're going to make a class called employee. And then we start thinking, okay, well, we're designing this, right? It's up to us what we want here. But you start thinking, well, what does an employee have? As you as the employer, what information might you want to have for your employee? Well, definitely a name. And so I'm going to write here things an employee has, and these are things of interest that interest us. These you can think of as the instance variables. And so you start thinking, okay, well, an employee has a name. That's for sure. Now, does every employee have the same name? Obviously not. So it wouldn't be good, or it would not be wise to put here the name of the employee, something like, I'll use my own name, right? Because if I put here name equals Octavio Ortiz, then any employee, when I make a new employee, it's going to have this name. And we don't want that. We want every employee to have their own name. And so I won't initialize this variable. I'm just going to declare the variable name. Name is a string. Now, oftentimes you'll see that this is preceded by the word private, and that means that the variable name can only be used inside of the class, inside of this employee class. It cannot, if it's private, you cannot access this variable outside of this class. We'll talk a little bit more about why that's useful, or why not, right? And so then we'll say, okay, well, what else does an employee have? An employee also has, so I'll declare this as a private. An employee also has a gender. So maybe we want to store the gender, but you start thinking, okay, gender, well, male or female. It's also going to be a string. And rather than just declare it like this on line 5, we could just say, okay, I'm gonna add it here on line 4 by placing it after a comma there, and it serves the same purpose, and I save myself one line of code. And so say, okay, well, they're both strings, so I can put them on the same line of code. If this was not a string, then I would have to make a new line. Okay, let's see, what about something that might not be a string? Well, something like the age of the employee, right? So that would be an integer, a whole number, age. Maybe you also want to store the means to contact your employee if necessary. So we'll put here email. Maybe you want to contact the email. The email. Maybe you want to contact the employee, and nowadays maybe email is best. Yeah, you could send a text. So we could also put a phone number, but I don't want to be dealing with too big of digits. I could make it a string. And so this is up to you. You're designing this. It's not. All the examples that we've worked on, typically they give you the instance variables, and maybe you ask yourself why. What's their purpose? I just understand that when you're making these classes, you get to choose. You decide. And so for now, to keep this somewhat short, I'm going to leave it like that. A name, a gender, age, and an email. And then we say, okay, we need a means, or we need to have a way to give these variables some value. Name, gender, email, and age. We need to give them a value. So like name equals, well, maybe Octavio Ortiz. Gender equals male. Email equals Ortiz, so on and so forth. And then age, I'm going to keep that one to myself. But in any case, that's what you want. And so we need to initialize the instance variables. And we do that using a constructor. Because a constructor is what lets you construct the employee. The employee is nothing without this basic information, right? So a constructor lets you construct the employee, and it lets you initialize these variables. Now, how do I know that what I code is a constructor? Well, when you code a constructor, it's always going to be public. Because if you don't declare it public, then a separate class cannot use the constructor. And we need the tester class, if you will, to be able to use the constructor, because it's the one that's going to initialize the variables. Now, when you make a method, you usually use public, void, and then the name of the constructor, followed by any parameters in parentheses. Now, for a constructor is a special kind of method. It's one whose name is always the same as the name of the class. And so I would copy that and just paste it there. And a constructor is never going to return anything. And so we don't have to include this term right here, void. We don't have to include it. And so we would get rid of that. Now, you can have a constructor that has no parameters. That would be what we call the zero argument constructor, or zero parameter constructor, whatever you want to call it. Then you can say, well, my employee, if somebody makes an employee and they don't tell me their information, I'm going to set it to what I want to set it. And so right here you'd have a default employer information, default employee. Like, hey, you didn't tell me the name, the gender, the email, and the age. I would never receive that information. So I need to set it to something. I'm going to set it to whatever I want here. And you would say name is equal to obviously some John Doe. I don't know if that's how you spell it, but okay. Gender, well, that's male. And then email, that'd be something like jdoe@hotmail.com. And then finally age. Well, John Doe he's young, you know, he's 20 years old. And so you say, well, let's say that somebody makes an employee, but they don't give me their information. I never get their information. Well, let's set it to this. This is what we call the zero argument constructor. Zero argument. I'll just abbreviate constructor. And then you say, well, what if they do give me the information? What if somebody sends me that, they send me the name, the gender, the email, and the age? And when I make an employee, I want to use that information. Well, that's where you would make another constructor, a separate constructor. I'm going to copy and paste to avoid myself rewriting a lot of this. What is true is that it still has the same name. So they have the same name, employee. They're still both public. They don't return anything, so we don't have the word void there. But this is not the zero argument constructor. You can call this maybe the multiple argument constructor. And instead of setting name to John Doe for the employee, I'm going to set it to whatever this parameter here is, string, and you can call it whatever. You can call this variable whatever you want. You could call it name if you want. I've somewhat avoided doing this so that I avoid any confusion. I'll just call it n, and then you also need a gender, so that's also a string G, and you also need an email, so I'll put an E there, and then finally you need an integer for the age. And I notice I use the first letter of each one: name, gender, email, and age. And what you can do is you can say the name of the employee. Remember, these are things, this is the information, the data for the employee, right? Name, gender, email, and age. And I need to initialize them. I need to say what do they equal. I'm going to say name equals, not John Doe. I'm going to use the information that I get from somewhere else, who knows where, but they're going to send me a name, and then it's going to be stored in this variable n. They're also going to send me a gender, and it's going to be stored in the variable g, and so I'm going to say gender is equal to g. And I'm also going to get an email that's going to be stored in this variable e, and so I'm going to set email to e. And then finally, they're going to send an age, which is an integer that's going to be stored in the variable a. And so I'm going to say age is a. And now we get to a point where, okay, well, this is all great, but what does it all mean? And so we start thinking about, well, let's test this. Let's see if this class that I'm making, this employee class, works how I want it to work. And so I'm going to compile, which is going to prompt me to just save my file. I'll go to the good old folder here that's for classes, where we looked at classes, because we at first weren't necessarily building classes. This is employee.java, and I'm going to compile, and I cannot find symbol gender. That's because I misspelled this. That's a D, and that's a D. And I'm going to compile. And this compiles fine. Now you ask yourself, well, good, we did all this work for what? Well, now we've made a general class called employee with code in it that lets us assign values to these variables, and this is all the pertinent information of an employee, and not all, but some, right? And so then we say, okay, well, let's make employees. Let's make a few employees. Well, we're going to make a separate class. And we can call this maybe not employee tester. Let's try to give it some more meaning. And so let's say that you're you're the employer and you own Target, you know? And you want to have all this information for the employees. You want to have access to it. And it doesn't matter that you could do it in Excel instead. It doesn't matter that you could do it in Word. You're a programmer and you want to use Java. And so in this target class, I'm going to have some employees. Now, when we execute a file, when we run a file, we do Control R, but you also use this little run button that we don't use often. It looks for a main method. It's looking where in my class is the main method, and if it doesn't find the main method, then it tells you, hey, I can't run this class. I'm looking for the main method and I can't find it. So for example, if I try to run this employee, no main methods, and it didn't find a main method. So it's always looking for a main method. And the employee class, the reason I didn't put a main method in here is because this is just this class is gonna hold this information for employees, and that's it. And so if I try to run this, well, it's not saved, but it would also say, hey, I can't find a main method. So let's write a main method: public class, public static void main. And now if I'm gonna compile, and I need to save this in the same directory, in the same folder where I saved the employee class, and call it target. It doesn't, you can call it employee tester, but it doesn't matter what you call it, right? Okay, target as in Target the store, right? You own Target, and you say, well, I have 50 employees, and we're not going to code 50 employees. We're going to code a few. But you start thinking to yourself, okay, I want to make an employee, and I want to store the information, the employee's name, gender, email, and their age. I want to store that information for all of my employees. And so you start getting into what we call instantiating. An object. That's one way that it's called, instantiating an object, which is, we also say, creating an instance of a class. Now, what's true is that we might have, at Target, we as the owner of Target, we have more than one employee. And so you can think of every employee as an object. But for every employee, for every object, we want to store the same information. And so we're going to always use the employee class to make this new object. And so we say, okay, well, let's make an employee. And we say, well, I know to make an employee object, I need to first tell Java what class to look at. Well, we need to look at an employee class, and then you need to give the object a name. And so you start going through the list of your employees, and you start alphabetically. And so your first employee, his name is Alex. And you say, well, employee Alex, I want to store some information for him. And you go to the employee class, and you know that Alex's name is Alex, and you know that Alex is a male, and you know that Alex's email is last name at target.org, and you know the age of Alex is 17, 18, right out of high school. And so you want to give those values for Alex. Now, what's true is that when we want to initialize these variables, we use the constructors. There's two. Can there be more than two? Absolutely, there can be more. You're not going to want to use this one because that would store these values for Alex, and these are not adequate values. You're probably going to want to use this one, and you should use this one, because this tells you that Alex's name is going to be whatever N is, and you get to choose that, and whatever G is, and whatever E is, and whatever A is. And so when I go to target and I say Alex is an employee, this is a new employee. I have never made this employee before. This is the first time. And if you put the parentheses without any arguments, with nothing inside, it's going to use the 0 argument constructor. It's going to run the code in here. It's not going to run this code at all. It's just going to run this. And we don't want that because that's not the information for Alex, right? And so how do we ensure that we run this code? Well, you do so by having 4. You need exactly 4 arguments because there's 4 parameters. Right here, we call them the variables right here. N, G, E, and A are called parameters. And so I would need a total of 4 arguments here. And the first is the name, so I would say something like Alex Segura. That's the name. And then the gender, male. And then the email, asegura@target.com or .org. And then the age, Alex is 18. Now, if you don't have 4, and I know I have 4 because they're separated by commas. Every argument is separated by a comma. There's a total of 4. 3 strings, those are the ones in quotes in green, and then 1 integer, a whole number. And if I compile right here, then I get no error. But if I only have 3 arguments, let's say that I forgot this one, then you're trying to send 3 arguments, 2 strings, and 1 integer. And there is no constructor that is expecting 3 parameters. There's no constructor with 3 parameters. There's one with no parameters. There's one with 4 parameters. And so if you try to compile this, you're going to get an error. It says no suitable constructor found, which, I mean, it's basically all right here. They're saying I didn't find a constructor that was expecting 1 string, another string, and an integer. And they tell you these are the constructors you have available to you. One with no arguments, and then one with 4 arguments. A string, a string, and an integer. And so Java knows that you're mistaken. And so you'd say, okay, I need to add another argument here, male, right? And if you compile this, now you're good. And this is, it's done something. You don't see anything. So let me clear this. If I run this, nothing happens. And it's not because, well, you don't see anything, but that's not because nothing happened. There's stuff that happened. Data was stored, specifically this data. It was stored. And by making an employee, think of it as keeping all that data at one location in your computer. And you say, well, I have more than 1 employee, and I want to make a new employee. And so you would do the same thing, and I'm going to copy this so that I don't have to start from scratch. So copy. I'm instantiating another object, or I'm making another instance of an employee. Now this employee, her name is Brittany. So that how you spell Brittany? Okay. And I'm going alphabetically, right? Brittany is also a new employee, or I guess I don't. It's the first time that we're storing here. We're making this employee, and then so Brittany. And then I don't know, I'm having a hard time coming up with the last name here. I don't know, Brittany Long. Brittany is a female. we have first letter here, and then we'll just say long, and Brittany is 27 years old. And so now we've created another object. Brittany is an object, it is an employee object. Or we can say it's another instance of the employee class. Here's one instance of the employee class. Here's another instance of the employee class. Now you start asking yourself, okay, well, what's the point? Well, the point is that suppose that you want to add more data for an employee. So you want maybe also the hire date. When was this employee hired? Well, that would require just one change here. Hire date, we'll just put here, we'll make it a string. So you can add another instance variable. And then we'll right here, we put here hire date for a default employee. Like if we don't get any information, you can just put here, and we can use a format for the date. We can say month, day, and year. And without any commas, just like that. Because maybe later on we want to get a substring here and check these dates, right? And so that's the hire date. However, if that's for a default employee, if I want a general hire date, or I want the user, the person, the target owner to give me the hire date, I would put here hire date equals H. And you'd come in here and you'd say, I'm going to add another string here, H, another parameter. And I would compile, and I would go right here, and I would say, okay, now if I compile, I'm going to get an error, because now there is no constructor that has 5 parameters, or that allows for I guess there's no constructor that has 4 parameters that allows for 4 arguments. There's 4 arguments here. There's one constructor that requires no parameters. And there's another constructor that requires a total of 5 parameters. 3 strings, an integer, and another string. And that's why it's having issues. Right here I have 3 strings, 1 integer. 3 strings, 1 integer, you're missing a string. And so it's saying, hey, there's no suitable constructor. And you'd have to put here the hire date. You'd say something like February 17, 2018. That's the hire date for Alex. And Brittany has been at Target for a little longer than Alex, so her hire date was October 1st, 2009. And now once again you have 2 instances of an employee. Alex is one instance, Alex is one employee, and then Brittany is a second instance of an employee. Or you can call them objects. Alex is an object, an employee object. Brittany is also an employee object. And this is how you always initialize or how you instantiate objects. You use the constructors. We're going to do one last thing here, which is print some of this information because we have it. I can compile and run, and that's good. But what if we want to retrieve the information for every employee? Maybe you happen to just sell Target, right, to someone else, and that some other person wants to know who works for him or her, and so they want to retrieve this information for all of the employees. Or you come in here, and we can use a special type of method. Special method, and what's special about it is its name. Its name is ToString. the ToString method. And the ToString method for any class returns a string. And typically, and not necessarily, meaning it can, but it's up to you, it typically returns the information that has to do with the instance variables in some nice formatted way. And so I would say here return. Well, let's return the information for an employee. Well, we would say return the name. Excuse me here. Plus whatever name for this employee is, plus, and I can press enter here, and pressing enter so that I can line this up. And then I'll put a enter key, so that's the escape sequence for pressing the enter key. We also want to know the gender. Oh, come on. Plus, oh, I need to terminate my string. Clearly, the keys here are evading me. Plus gender, plus, there we go. And then I'm gonna also do the email. Plus email, plus I also want age, plus age, and then finally I want the hire date. And that's going to be the last one, so I put a colon. Java doesn't care about white space, and so it doesn't care the fact that I put these in separate lines of code. And this is only for just aesthetics, you know, so that it looks good to the eye. And so a special method called the ToString method. Doesn't show up so much on the APCSA, but it's very useful, especially when we want to retrieve information from a class very quickly. So I compile. And then when you go to your target, all you have to do here is if you print an employee object. So how many employee objects do I have? I have 2. Alex is an employee and Brittany is another employee. So if I print Alex just like that, it will print whatever the ToString method returns. Now for Alex, the ToString method should return different information than if I print Brittany, because the instance variables are different for the two. So if I print Brittany here, I should get 2 different values. Just for clarity here, I'll print just some asterisks so we can see visually the where one object ends and the other one begins, like that. And so again, if you print the object Alex, it prints whatever its ToString method returns. Same here. And if I compile and if I run, you'll see the information for the 2: name, gender, email, age, hire date, and then we have the same for Brittany. Okay, on the next video, I'll talk about some methods and maybe manipulating some of the data from for each employee using those methods.